What would you do if you heard desperate crying coming from your old well at 3 in the morning, only to discover something that would change your life forever? By the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the people we try to save might be the very ones who destroy us. The autumn wind howled across the desolate farmlands of rural Nebraska, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of a harsh winter ahead. Thomas Mitchell had been living alone on his grandfather's farm for nearly 15 years. Ever since his wife Sarah had passed away in that terrible car accident, the 340-acre property outside of Grand Island had once been bustling with life, filled with the laughter of children and the warmth of family gatherings. Now, it stood as a monument to loneliness, with only the occasional visit from his neighbor, elderly Mrs. Henderson, to break the monotonous routine of his isolated existence. Thomas had grown accustomed to the sounds of his solitary world, the creaking of old wooden beams in the farmhouse, the distant lowing of his cattle, and the perpetual whisper of wind through the cornfields. At 52 years old, his weathered hands told the story of decades spent working the land, while his graying beard and deep-set brown eyes reflected a man who had seen both joy and profound sorrow. He had built his life around predictability and routine, finding comfort in the unchanging rhythm of farm work that kept his mind occupied and his heart from dwelling too long on what he had lost. On this particular October night, Thomas had gone to bed earlier than usual, exhausted from a long day of harvesting the last of his corn crop. The farmhouse, built in 1923 by his grandfather Henrik Mitchell, stood like a weathered sentinel against the vast Nebraska sky. Its white paint had long since faded to a dull gray, and several of the shutters hung askew, but it remained solid and dependable, much like Thomas himself. The nearest neighbor lived nearly 2 miles away, and the closest town, Cedar Rapids, was a 20-minute drive down a winding gravel road that turned to mud whenever it rained. As Thomas lay in his bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the old house settling for the night, something unusual pierced through the darkness. At first he thought it might be the wind playing tricks on him, or perhaps a coyote in the distance. But as he strained to listen, the sound became clearer and more distinct. It was crying, unmistakably human crying, coming from somewhere outside his house. The sound was faint but persistent, rising and falling like a mournful song carried on the night air. Thomas sat up in bed, his heart beginning to race as he tried to pinpoint the source of the sound. For a moment, he wondered if he might be dreaming, or if the loneliness had finally begun to affect his mind. But the crying continued, growing slightly louder and more desperate. He reached for the lamp beside his bed and checked the time. 3:17 a.m., the witching hour, his grandmother used to call it, when the veil between worlds was thinnest. Pulling on his worn jeans and a thick flannel shirt, Thomas grabbed the heavy flashlight from his nightstand and made his way downstairs. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he moved through the darkened house, guided by years of muscle memory. He paused at the front door, listening intently. The crying was definitely coming from outside, somewhere in the direction of the old well that sat about 50 yards behind the house. The well had been dug by his great-grandfather in 1889 and had served the family faithfully for decades before they had installed modern plumbing in the 1960s. Since then, it had been covered with a heavy wooden lid and largely forgotten, used occasionally as a conversation piece when visitors asked about the history of the property. Thomas hadn't even thought about the old well in months, maybe years. As he stepped out into the cold night air, the crying became more pronounced. It was definitely a woman's voice, he realized, filled with a desperation that made his skin crawl. The sound seemed to echo up from somewhere below ground level, which made no logical sense unless someone was actually in the well. The thought sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the October cold. Thomas hurried across the yard, his flashlight beam dancing ahead of him as he navigated around the rusted farm equipment and overgrown garden that had once been Sarah's pride and joy. As he approached the well, the crying suddenly stopped, as if whoever was making the sound had heard his footsteps approaching. The silence that followed was somehow even more unsettling than the crying had been. The wooden cover of the well sat exactly where it always had, secured with the same rusty iron latch that his grandfather had installed decades earlier. Thomas knelt beside it, pressing his ear close to the wood. For several long moments, there was nothing but silence. Then, just as he was beginning to convince himself that he had imagined the whole thing, a voice called out from the depths below, weak, frightened, and unmistakably female. "Help me," the voice pleaded, barely more than a whisper but carrying clearly in the still night air. "Please, someone help me. I've been down here for so long." Thomas's hands shook as he fumbled with the iron latch. The metal was cold and corroded, and it took several attempts before he could work it loose. As he lifted the heavy wooden cover, a musty smell rose up from the depths of the well, the scent of stagnant water mixed with something else, something organic and unsettling that he couldn't quite identify. Shining his flashlight down into the well, Thomas saw something that would be burned into his memory forever. About 20 feet down, Sitting on what appeared to be a narrow ledge just above the waterline was a young woman. She was bound with rope around her wrists and ankles, her long dark hair hanging in matted strands around her face. Her clothes were torn and dirty, suggesting she had been trapped down there for some time. When the light hit her face, she looked up at him with eyes that reflected a mixture of hope and terror. "Thank God," she gasped, her voice echoing off the stone walls of the well. "I thought I was going to die down here. Please, you have to help me get out." Thomas's mind raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. How had this woman ended up in his well? How long had she been there? And most importantly, who had put her there? The ropes around her wrists and ankles clearly indicated that this was no accident. Someone had deliberately trapped her in this forgotten corner of his property. "What's your name?" Thomas called down to her, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring despite the shock and confusion he was feeling. "Rebecca," she replied, her voice trembling with cold and fear. "Rebecca Sullivan. I'm from Omaha. Someone grabbed me when I was walking to my car after work 3 days ago. I woke up down here, and I've been trapped ever since." Thomas knew he needed to call the police immediately, but his priority was getting Rebecca out of the well before she died of exposure or dehydration. The October nights in Nebraska could be brutally cold, and she had already been down there for 3 days, according to her account. He looked around his property, trying to figure out how to safely extract her from the 20-foot deep well. The old rope and pulley system that had once been used to draw water from the well was long gone. But Thomas remembered seeing some climbing rope in his barn that he had used for securing tops and equipment. He also had a sturdy ladder that might reach most of the way down if he could position it correctly. "Rebecca, I'm going to get some rope and a ladder," he called down to her. "I'll be right back. Try to stay warm and keep talking to me so I know you're okay." As he hurried toward the barn, Thomas's mind was spinning with questions and concerns. The nearest police station was in Grand Island, nearly 30 minutes away. Even if he called them immediately, it would take time for them to respond, and Rebecca needed help now. But at the same time, the situation felt surreal and dangerous in ways he couldn't quite articulate in the barn. Thomas quickly gathered the climbing rope, his extension ladder, and a thick blanket. As he carried the equipment back toward the well, he called out to Rebecca to let her know he was returning. Her weak response from the depths below spurred him to move faster. Setting up the ladder proved to be more challenging than he had anticipated. The well's opening was relatively narrow, and the ladder was almost too wide to fit properly. After several attempts, he managed to angle it down into the well, though it only reached about halfway to where Rebecca was sitting. The climbing rope would have to make up the difference. "I'm going to lower a rope down to you," Thomas explained as he secured one end around the base of an old oak tree that stood near the well. "I need you to tie it around your waist, and then I'll help pull you up to where you can reach the ladder." As he lowered the rope into the well, Thomas heard Rebecca moving around below, apparently trying to position herself to grab it despite her bound hands. The process was slow and difficult, made more challenging by her weakened condition and the limited mobility caused by the ropes around her wrists. "I've got it," she finally called up, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "But I can't tie it properly with my hands bound like this. Can you pull me up slowly while I—" "Hold on." Thomas hesitated. Pulling someone up 20 feet using only a rope was dangerous under the best of circumstances, and Rebecca's bound hands made it even more precarious. But leaving her down there while he waited for professional help wasn't an option either. She was already hypothermic and dehydrated, and another few hours might be the difference between life and death. "Hold on as tight as you can," Thomas instructed, beginning to pull the rope hand over hand. Rebecca was lighter than he had expected, but the awkward angle and the distance made it exhausting work. Every few feet, he paused to rest and check on her progress. Gradually, Rebecca rose through the darkness of the well. Thomas could hear her struggling to maintain her grip on the rope, occasionally gasping or whimpering with the effort. When she finally reached the ladder, he helped guide her hands to the rungs and supported her as she climbed the remaining distance to the surface. When Rebecca finally emerged from the well, collapsing onto the cold ground beside Thomas, he got his first clear look at her in the beam of his flashlight. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with shoulder-length brown hair and green eyes that reflected both gratitude and lingering fear. Her clothes, a navy blue business suit that had clearly seen better days, suggested she had been telling the truth about being grabbed after work. The rope burns around her wrists were red and raw, indicating she had been struggling against her bonds for some time. Her lips were chapped, and her skin was pale from cold and dehydration. But despite her ordeal, there was something about her that struck Thomas as remarkably composed, considering what she had just been through. "We need to get you inside and call the police," Thomas said, helping Rebecca to her feet. She leaned heavily against him as they made their way toward the farmhouse, her legs shaky from the prolonged confinement and the physical exertion of the rescue. Inside the warm kitchen, Thomas wrapped Rebecca in several blankets and gave her a glass of water, which she drank eagerly. As he reached for the phone to call 911, she grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Wait," she said, her voice suddenly more steady than it had been since he first heard her crying. "There's something you need to know before you call the police." The person who did this to me. I think they might still be watching the property. When they put me in that well, they said they'd be back to finish what they started. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. What do you mean, finish what they started? Rebecca's eyes darted toward the darkened windows of the kitchen, as if she expected to see someone watching them from outside. They said I knew too much about something. They didn't want to kill me right away. They wanted me to suffer first, but they're coming back tomorrow night to finish it. The implications of what Rebecca was telling him began to sink in. If her captor was planning to return, then both of them were potentially in danger. Thomas's isolated farm, which had always been a source of comfort and security, suddenly felt exposed and vulnerable. What did you see that made them want to hurt you? Thomas asked, settling into the chair across from Rebecca. Despite his desire to call for help immediately, he realized he needed to understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. Rebecca wrapped the blankets more tightly around herself and began to tell a story that would challenge everything. Thomas thought he knew about his quiet corner of Nebraska. She worked as an accountant for a small trucking company in Omaha called Midwest Transport Solutions. 3 weeks earlier, she had noticed some irregularities in the company's financial records, large cash payments with no corresponding invoices, and shipping manifests that didn't match the actual cargo being transported. Being thorough and conscientious by nature, Rebecca had begun to investigate these discrepancies on her own time. What she discovered was evidence of a sophisticated smuggling operation using the trucking company as a front. Drugs, weapons, and even human trafficking appeared to be regular parts of the business, hidden behind legitimate cargo shipments. The night she was kidnapped, Rebecca had been planning to take her evidence to the FBI the following morning. She had compiled detailed financial records, shipping logs, and even some photographs she had taken of suspicious cargo being loaded and unloaded at unusual hours. All of this evidence was now sitting in a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Omaha, waiting for her to retrieve it. But how did they know you had discovered their operation? Thomas asked, his mind struggling to process the enormity of what Rebecca was telling him. Rebecca's expression darkened. I think someone at the company figured out what I was doing. Maybe they noticed me staying late to access the computer systems, or maybe they found out about the safety deposit box. Whatever happened, they must have decided I was too much of a threat to let live. As if to emphasize the danger they were in, a sound from outside made both of them freeze. It was the distant rumble of a vehicle approaching down the gravel road that led to Thomas's farm. At this hour of the night, and given the isolated location of the property, any visitor was cause for concern. Thomas moved quickly to turn off the kitchen lights, plunging the room into darkness. Through the window he could see headlights approaching, through the cornfields, moving slowly as if the driver was being careful not to make too much noise. The vehicle stopped about a quarter mile from the house, and the lights went out. They're here, Rebecca whispered, her voice filled with terror. They must have been watching the place, waiting for someone to find me. Thomas's mind raced as he tried to formulate a plan. His farmhouse was isolated, with no neighbors close enough to hear gunshots or calls for help. His cell phone was upstairs, and the landline was here in the kitchen, but making a call now might alert whoever was outside to their presence. Most importantly, he had no weapons beyond a few hunting rifles locked in a cabinet upstairs. We need to get out of here, Thomas said quietly. My truck is in the barn. If we can make it there without being seen, we might be able to get away and call for help from town. Rebecca nodded, her training as someone who had survived 3 days in a well apparently having taught her to stay calm under pressure. Together, they moved through the darkened house toward the back door, staying low and avoiding the windows where their silhouettes might be visible to anyone watching from outside. The barn was about 75 yards from the house, across an open area that offered little cover. Thomas knew that once they left the house, they would be completely exposed to anyone with night vision equipment or simply good eyes. But staying in the house felt like waiting to be trapped. As they prepared to make their move, Thomas heard voices outside, at least 2 men, possibly more, speaking in low tones as they approached the house. He couldn't make out what they were saying, but their tone was businesslike and determined. These weren't random criminals, they were professionals, who had come here with a specific purpose. Thomas grabbed Rebecca's hand and led her out the back door into the cold night air. They moved as quickly and quietly as possible across the yard, using the shadows cast by farm equipment and outbuildings to conceal their movement. Every step, it seemed to echo loudly in the still night, and Thomas was certain that anyone nearby would be able to hear them. Halfway to the barn, they heard the sound of breaking glass from the direction of the house. Their pursuers had apparently grown tired of waiting and decided to enter by force. This gave Thomas and Rebecca a brief window of opportunity while the intruders searched the house for their quarry. They reached the barn just as lights appeared in the windows of the farmhouse. Thomas's hands shook as he fumbled with the barn door, trying to open it quietly while also moving quickly enough to get them away before they were discovered. His old Ford pickup truck sat in the barn like a faithful friend. Its blue paint faded but its engine reliable. As Thomas turned the key in the ignition, he held his breath. The truck was old and sometimes temperamental, especially on cold nights. But this time, the engine turned over immediately with a satisfying rumble. Without turning on the headlights, Thomas put the truck in gear and began to back out of the barn. They had almost made it to the road when flashlight beams began sweeping across the yard from the direction of the house. Shouts echoed through the night as their pursuers realized that their targets had escaped. Thomas floored the accelerator, and the old pickup truck lurched forward down the gravel road, its tires spinning and sending up clouds of dust and small stones dotting the rearview mirror. Thomas could see lights moving rapidly behind them as their pursuers ran toward their own vehicle. The chase was on, and Thomas knew that his old truck would be no match for whatever modern vehicle their pursuers were driving. His only advantage was his intimate knowledge of the back roads and farm trails that crisscrossed this part of Nebraska. Instead of heading toward the main highway, Thomas turned onto a narrow dirt road that wound through several neighboring farms before eventually connecting to a county road that led to Cedar Rapids. The road was rough and full of potholes, but it would be difficult for their pursuers to follow at high speed, especially in the dark. "Who are these people?" Thomas asked as he navigated the treacherous road, trying to balance speed with the need to maintain control of the vehicle. Rebecca braced herself against the dashboard as the truck bounced over a particularly large pothole. "I think they work for Victor Kozlov," she said. "He's the real owner of Midwest Transport Solutions, though his name doesn't appear on any of the official paperwork. From what I could tell from the financial records, he's been using the trucking company to move illegal cargo throughout the Midwest for at least 5 years." The name Victor Kozlov meant nothing to Thomas, but the implications were clear. They were dealing with organized crime, possibly with international connections, and that meant their pursuers would be well-funded, well-equipped, and extremely dangerous. Local law enforcement might not be sufficient to handle this situation. They reached a county road. Thomas could see headlights approaching rapidly from behind. Their pursuers had apparently managed to follow them despite the difficult terrain. Thomas turned toward Cedar Rapids and pressed the accelerator as far as it would go, but the old truck's engine was already being pushed to its limits. "There's something else," Rebecca said, her voice barely audible over the noise of the engine and the wind rushing through the slightly open windows. "The reason they didn't just kill me immediately wasn't just because they wanted me to suffer. They need to know how much evidence I collected and where I hid it. Without that information, they can't be sure they've eliminated the threat to their operation." This revelation added another layer of complexity to their situation. Even if they managed to escape their immediate pursuers, Rebecca would remain a target until Kozlov's organization was completely neutralized. And now, by helping her, Thomas had made himself a target as well. The lights of Cedar Rapids appeared ahead of them, offering the promise of safety and help. But as they approached the outskirts of town, their pursuer's vehicle began to close the distance rapidly. Thomas could see in his rearview mirror that it was a large black SUV, the kind of vehicle that suggested serious money and serious intent. Thomas made a split-second decision to bypass the main street of Cedar Rapids and head directly for the sheriff's substation on the edge of town. It was a small building with limited staffing, especially at night, but it represented official law enforcement and the possibility of safety. As they pulled into the parking lot of the sheriff's substation, Thomas was dismayed to see that the building appeared to be empty. A single light was on in what looked like a reception area, but there were no police vehicles in the parking lot. In a small town like Cedar Rapids, the sheriff's office operated with minimal overnight staffing, and deputies were often out on patrol or responding to calls in other parts of the county. Behind them, the black SUV had stopped at the edge of the parking lot, apparently waiting to see what Thomas and Rebecca would do next. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with both vehicles sitting motionless in the cold night air. "They won't try anything here," Rebecca said, though her voice suggested she wasn't entirely certain of this assessment. "Too public, too risky, but they'll wait for us to leave, and then they'll follow us wherever we go." Thomas realized that their temporary safety was an illusion. Even if deputies arrived at the substation, what could he tell them? That armed men were chasing them based on a woman's claim about discovering evidence of a criminal organization. Without proof, and given Rebecca's appearance after 3 days in a well, the authorities might be more inclined to think she was having some kind of psychological episode. The evidence Rebecca had mentioned was in a safety deposit box in Omaha, nearly 2 hours away. Getting to it would require traveling through open countryside where their pursuers could easily intercept them. But without that evidence, they had no way to prove their claims or to convince law enforcement to take their situation seriously. As Thomas pondered their options, Rebecca made a suggestion that surprised him. "There's someone else who might be able to help us," she said. "Another employee at Midwest Transport Solutions who I think suspected something was wrong. Her name is Maria Santos, and she works in the dispatch office. If we could contact her, she might be willing to confirm what I discovered." The idea of involving another civilian in their dangerous situation made Thomas uncomfortable, but he recognized that they needed allies if they were going to survive this ordeal. "How would we reach her without putting her in danger?" he asked. Rebecca explained that Maria lived in a small apartment complex in Grand Island, about 45 minutes away. She worked the night shift at the trucking company, which meant she would currently be at the office. If they could reach her at work, they might be able to warn her about the danger and convince her to help them gather additional evidence. The plan was risky, but it offered the possibility of building a stronger case against Kozlov's organization, while also potentially gaining an ally who understood the inner workings of the criminal operation. Thomas started the truck and began to back out of the parking lot, keeping a close eye on the black SUV that continued to watch them from the shadows. As they left Cedar Rapids behind and headed toward Grand Island, Thomas noticed that their pursuers were following at a distance, apparently content to track their movements rather than forcing another confrontation. This gave him some hope that they might be able to reach Maria Santos and begin building the case they needed to survive this ordeal. The drive to Grand Island took them through some of the most isolated farmland in central Nebraska. Mile after mile of empty fields stretched out on either side of the highway, broken only by the occasional farmhouse or grain elevator. The landscape that Thomas normally found comforting now felt ominous and threatening, offering countless places where their pursuers could stage an ambush without fear of witnesses. During the drive, Rebecca told Thomas more about her investigation of Midwest Transport Solutions and the evidence she had compiled. The scope of the criminal organization was larger than he had initially realized, involving not just drug smuggling, but also human trafficking, money laundering, and illegal weapon sales. The operation had connections throughout the Midwest and apparently extended to other parts of the country as well. What made the situation even more dangerous was the level of corruption that seemed to exist within some local law enforcement agencies. Rebecca had discovered financial records suggesting that several sheriff's departments and police forces were receiving regular payments from Kozlov's organization. This meant that turning to the authorities for help could potentially expose them to even greater danger. As they approached Grand Island, Thomas began to formulate a more comprehensive plan for exposing the criminal organization and ensuring their own safety. They would need to gather enough evidence to interest federal law enforcement agencies like the FBI, who would be less likely to be compromised by local corruption. They would also need to find a way to protect themselves and any other witnesses until the criminals could be arrested and prosecuted. The Midwest Transport Solutions office was located in an industrial area on the outskirts of Grand Island, surrounded by warehouses and trucking companies that served the agricultural economy of central Nebraska. At this hour of the night, most of the businesses were closed and the area was largely deserted, which could work either for or against them depending on how events unfolded. Thomas parked his truck in the shadows, behind a neighboring warehouse, where it would be hidden from casual observation but still allow them to watch the trucking company's office. The black SUV that had been following them was nowhere to be seen, but Thomas assumed their pursuers were somewhere nearby, waiting for the right moment to act. The Midwest Transport Solutions building was a modest single-story structure with a small fleet of trucks parked in the adjacent lot. Lights were on in what appeared to be the dispatch office, confirming that the night shift was currently at work. The challenge would be making contact with Maria Santos without alerting other employees who might be connected to the criminal operation. Rebecca suggested that she approach the building alone, reasoning that her appearance might be less threatening than if Thomas accompanied her. But given her weakened condition and the danger posed by potentially compromised employees, Thomas insisted on staying close enough to provide help if needed. As they prepared to approach the building, a new complication arose. Another vehicle pulled into the trucking company's parking lot, a police car from the Grand Island Police Department. For a moment, Thomas felt a surge of hope that help had finally arrived. But Rebecca's reaction was one of alarm rather than relief. "That's Officer Bradley Morrison," she whispered, recognizing the policeman who got out of the patrol car. "According to the financial records I found, he's been receiving regular payments from the company. He's part of the conspiracy." The appearance of a corrupt police officer fundamentally changed the dynamics of their situation. If Morrison was here, it probably meant that their pursuers had called in reinforcements and were preparing to end the chase permanently. Thomas and Rebecca were now trapped between the criminal organization and compromised law enforcement, with few options for escape or assistance. As they watched from their hiding place, Morrison entered the Midwest Transport Solutions building, apparently for a pre-arranged meeting. This gave Thomas and Rebecca a brief window of opportunity to try to contact Maria Santos, but it also meant they would need to be extremely careful not to be detected. Thomas decided to try a different approach. Instead of approaching the building directly, he would call the trucking company's main number and ask to speak with Maria Santos privately. This would allow them to make contact without physically exposing themselves to danger, while also giving Maria a chance to confirm or deny Rebecca's suspicions about the criminal operation. Using his cell phone, Thomas dialed the number for Midwest Transport Solutions that was displayed on a sign outside the building. After several rings, a woman's voice answered with a professional greeting. When Thomas asked to speak with Maria Santos, there was a brief pause before he was transferred to the dispatch office. "This is Maria," a nervous-sounding voice said when the call was finally connected. "Can I help you?" Thomas quickly explained. that he was calling on behalf of Rebecca Sullivan, who had discovered evidence of criminal activity at the company and was now in danger as a result. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment Thomas thought the connection had been lost. Finally, Maria spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is Rebecca safe? We've all been told she had some kind of nervous breakdown and disappeared from work, but I suspected something else had happened to her." The fact that Maria immediately believed their story and expressed concern for Rebecca's safety suggested that she was indeed an ally rather than part of the criminal conspiracy. Thomas quickly outlined their current situation and asked if Maria would be willing to help them gather additional evidence to present to federal authorities. Maria's response was both encouraging and alarming. She confirmed that she had also noticed irregularities in the company's operations and had been keeping her own informal records of suspicious activities. However, she also warned that Officer Morrison's presence at the building tonight was part of a larger plan to eliminate anyone who might pose a threat to the organization. "They're planning something big for tomorrow night," Maria whispered urgently. "I overheard a conversation between Morrison and the night manager about moving a special shipment and cleaning up loose ends. I think they're planning to eliminate Rebecca and anyone who's helped her." This information confirmed Thomas's worst fears about the scope of the danger they were facing. The criminal organization wasn't just trying to silence one accountant who had stumbled onto their operation. They were preparing to eliminate all potential witnesses and evidence in a coordinated effort to protect their enterprise. Maria agreed to help by copying additional financial records and shipping manifests that could be used as evidence, but she warned that she would need to be extremely careful not to be detected. The building was equipped with security cameras, and several employees were known to be part of the criminal conspiracy. As Thomas ended the call, he noticed movement in the parking lot of the trucking company. Officer Morrison was leaving the building, but instead of getting into his patrol car, he was walking toward the warehouse where Thomas and Rebecca were hiding. Somehow, their location had been discovered. Thomas grabbed Rebecca's hand and led her quickly toward the back of the warehouse, hoping to reach his truck before Morrison could surround the building. But as they rounded the corner, they came face to face with two men in dark clothing who had apparently been positioned to cut off their escape route. "Rebecca Sullivan," one of the men said in a voice that was calm and professional, "you've caused us a considerable amount of trouble. It's time to finish this." The confrontation that Thomas had been dreading was finally at hand, but as he prepared to fight for their lives, Rebecca stepped forward with a confidence that surprised him. "Before you do anything you'll regret," she said, addressing the armed men directly. "You should know that the evidence I collected isn't just sitting in a safety deposit box in Omaha. I made copies and gave them to someone you'll never find. If anything happens to me, those copies will be delivered directly to the FBI." The claim was a bluff. Rebecca had told Thomas earlier that all of her evidence was in the single safety deposit box, but the uncertainty it created in their captors' minds might be enough to buy them some time or create an opportunity for escape. One of the armed men spoke quietly into a radio, apparently consulting with someone else about how to handle this new development. During this brief delay, Thomas noticed that Maria Santos had appeared in the doorway of the trucking company building, clearly watching the confrontation with alarm. What happened next would determine whether Thomas and Rebecca survived to expose the criminal organization, or whether they became the latest victims of a conspiracy that reached deeper into the Nebraska law enforcement community than anyone had imagined. The lonely farmer who had simply wanted to help a woman in distress was about to discover that sometimes doing the right thing requires courage he never knew he possessed. The standoff in the shadow of the warehouse represented a turning point, not just for Thomas and Rebecca, but for everyone connected to the Midwest Transport Solutions conspiracy. The evidence that Rebecca had painstakingly gathered was about to be put to the ultimate test, and the quiet farmlands of Nebraska were about to become the setting for a confrontation that would expose corruption, reaching from local police departments to international criminal organizations. As the armed men waited for instructions from their superiors, and as Maria Santos wrestled with the decision of whether to risk her own safety to help strangers, the night air seemed to hold its breath. In a few moments, the careful balance of power that had allowed Viktor Kozlov's organization to operate with impunity for years would be shattered forever. Thomas looked at Rebecca, seeing in her eyes the same determination that had allowed her to survive 3 days in a well and then convince a stranger to risk his life to help her. Whatever happened next, they had come too far to give up now. The truth about Midwest Transport Solutions was going to come to light, no matter what the cost.